The wind had a voice in Wyoming, and that winter of 1878 it mostly screamed. It was a raw, keening sound that scraped across the plains, tearing at the few stubborn trees that dared to grow and scouring the clapboard walls of Dust Creek's small schoolhouse. For Mary Whitlock, the sound was the loneliest thing she had ever known. It was a constant reminder of the immense, empty space that surrounded her, a space so different from the close-knit green hills of her Ohio home. At 22, Mary had come west with a trunk full of books and a heart full of ideals. She was to be the town's new schoolteacher, a beacon of knowledge in a land of dust and hard men. The town council had given her the use of the small cabin that stood a quarter-mile from the schoolhouse itself, a solitary box of timber against a vast, unforgiving landscape. It was clean and sturdy, but the wind found every crack. Her life had settled into a rhythm dictated by the school bell and the setting sun. She would rise in the dark, her breath fogging in the cold air, and light her small stove. She'd eat her oatmeal, pin her honey-colored hair into a severe but neat bun at the nape of her neck, and walk the frozen path to the schoolhouse. Her students were a mix of rough farm boys with dirt under their fingernails and shy girls in faded calico dresses. They were good children, mostly, hungry for the stories she read and the sums she chalked on the slate board. Teaching them was the one thing that made the loneliness bearable. It gave her purpose. But when the last child had been bundled into their coat and sent home, the quiet would descend again, broken only by that incessant, howling wind. The evenings were the hardest. She would sit in a rocking chair, a mending basket in her lap, and watch the fire in the hearth. She read her Bible. She read Shakespeare. She wrote letters home that painted a brighter picture than the one she was living. She never mentioned the fear that sometimes crept in, a cold finger tracing her spine. It was the fear of the unknown, of the sheer, wild emptiness of the land, and of the men who roamed it. The townsfolk were kind enough in their own gruff way, but she knew she was an outsider, a delicate bird in a land of hawks. Her reputation was a fragile thing, the only currency she truly possessed. That night, the storm was worse than any she had yet endured. It wasn't just wind. It was a fury of sleet and snow that hammered against her little cabin as if trying to tear it from its foundations. The windows rattled, and the door shuddered in its frame. Mary had double-checked the latch, stuffed a rag along the bottom to keep out the draft, and built up the fire until the hearth glowed with a defiant warmth. She was trying to read, but the words on the page blurred with every violent gust. The world had been reduced to the roaring darkness outside and the small, flickering circle of light inside. The sound, when it came, was so unexpected that she dropped her book. It was not the wind. It was a solid, deliberate thud against her door, once, twice, 3 times. Her heart leaped into her throat. No one came calling in Dust Creek after dark, and certainly not in a storm like this. It could be a rancher from a nearby spread, his wagon broken down. It could be Mrs. Henderson, the blacksmith's wife, needing help. Or it could be something else entirely. Drifters, outlaws, the stories the townswomen whispered among themselves. Tales of violence and desperation flooded her mind. She froze in her chair, every muscle tense. The knocking came again, louder this time, more urgent. A man's voice, low and strained, was swallowed almost completely by the wind, but she caught a single word. "Please." Mary pressed a hand to her chest, her breath coming in shallow bursts. Her father's voice echoed in her memory. A stern warning from a lifetime ago: a woman alone is a target. The ladies of the town's church auxiliary, led by the formidable Martha Greeley, had said as much. A schoolteacher, above all, must be beyond reproach. Her virtue was as much a part of her job as her ability to teach arithmetic. To open her door to a strange man at this hour, in this storm, would be madness. It would be ruin. She stayed silent, hoping he would give up, that the storm would drive him on. But he did not. There was another series of knocks, weaker this time. followed by the sound of a heavy slump against the wood. He was out there, collapsing in the blizzard, on her doorstep. Her conscience warred with her fear. She saw him freezing to death, his body discovered in the morning, and knew that her inaction would be a sin far greater than any gossip. She could not let a man die when she had a fire and a roof. Taking a shaky breath, she picked up the iron poker from the hearth, its weight a small, cold comfort in her hand. She crept to the door. "Who is it?" she called out, her voice thin against the storm's roar. A moment of silence. Then the voice came again, closer to the floor this time. "Just a traveler. Caught in the storm. My horse went down." His words were clipped, labored. He sounded exhausted, not threatening. Still, she hesitated. This was Wyoming. A man's voice could be as false as a snake's smile, but the image of him lying in the snow, the sound of that single word, "Please," tipped the scale. Her humanity won out. Slowly, her fingers trembling, she slid the bolt back. She turned the knob and pulled the door inward, bracing herself against the blast of wind and ice that immediately swept into the room, threatening to extinguish her lamp. The man was huddled on her porch, half kneeling, half lying against the wall. He was a large figure, made larger by a heavy, soaked cattleman's coat. Snow and ice clung to his wide-brimmed hat and his shoulders. As he looked up, the lamplight fell on his face. He was not old, perhaps 30 or so, with a strong jaw darkened by several days' worth of stubble. A gash on his temple was bleeding sluggishly, the blood mingling with the rain on his skin. But it was his eyes that held her. They were a startlingly clear gray, and in their depths, she saw not menace, but a profound and bottomless weariness. He tried to push himself up, to stand on his own 2 feet, but he swayed. "Ma'am," he said, his voice raspy. "I apologize for the intrusion. If you just have a barn, anywhere out of this wind." Mary looked past him into the swirling vortex of black and white. There was no barn, only her small woodshed, which would offer little protection from a storm this fierce. To send him there would be the same as leaving him on the doorstep. She made her decision. "You can't stay out here," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "Come in." He looked at her, a flicker of surprise in those tired eyes, then gave a slow, grateful nod. He pulled himself up using the doorframe, his movements stiff with cold and pain. He took one step inside and then another, bringing the chill of the storm into her warm, small home. He dripped water onto the clean pine floorboards, a dark pool spreading around his worn boots. He removed his hat, revealing a thick mat of dark, damp hair. He held the hat in his hands, turning the brim over and over, as if he didn't know what to do with himself in this small, feminine space. He was an intrusion of the wild, untamed world into her sanctuary of order and books. She shut the door, the latch clicking shut with a sound of finality, and leaned against it for a moment. Her heart still hammering. The wind howled outside, but it sounded farther away now. They were alone. 2 strangers sealed in a small wooden box against the fury of the night. The silence inside was more deafening than the storm. It was filled with unspoken questions and a palpable tension. "You're hurt," she said, nodding toward the cut on his forehead. "It's nothing. My horse slipped on a patch of ice, threw me clear, but I hit my head on a rock." He spoke quietly, his gaze fixed on the floor. He seemed acutely aware of his own size, of the space he took up in her tiny cabin. "You should sit by the fire," Mary said, finding her purpose in the simple duties of a hostess. "You're freezing." He moved toward the hearth with a slight limp, his boots loud on the floorboards. He stood before the flames, his back to her, and steam began to rise from his wet coat. Mary watched him, her hand still loosely gripping the iron poker. He was a stranger. She knew nothing about him, not even his name. Yet she had invited him into her home. The weight of her decision settled upon her.
I can make some coffee,
she offered, needing to do something, to break the charged stillness. Thank you, ma'am, he said without turning around. That would be a kindness. She moved to the small stove, her actions mechanical. She measured the coffee grounds, pumped the water, her mind racing. What would people say? What would Deputy Cole, a man who had made his unwelcome attentions clear, think if he found out? What would Mrs. Greeley do? They would call her foolish at best, and fallen at worst. A schoolteacher's reputation was gossamer thin, once torn. It could never be mended. She glanced over her shoulder at the man. He had taken off his heavy coat and laid it carefully over the back of a chair near the fire. Underneath, he wore a simple wool shirt, stretched taut across broad shoulders. He was lean, but powerfully built, a man shaped by hard work and open spaces. Now that the firelight played more fully on his face, she could see the lines etched around his eyes and mouth, lines of hardship that made him look older than his years. There was a deep sadness in the set of his jaw, a quiet grief that seemed to be a permanent part of him. He was not just a cowboy, she realized. He was a man who had known loss. The fire in the hearth had burned low while she was distracted by the storm. It was now little more than a bed of sullen, glowing embers. A chill was beginning to seep back into the room. Mary set the coffee pot on the stove and went to the wood box. "The fire needs tending," she said, more to herself than to him. She knelt on the hearth, her hands, accustomed to holding chalk and books, fumbling with the kindling. They were shaking, a betraying tremor she could not control. She was intensely aware of him standing just a few feet away, a silent, looming presence. She arranged the small sticks, but her fingers were clumsy, and the structure collapsed. A small sigh of frustration escaped her lips. A low voice spoke from behind her. "You need to let the air get underneath." She looked up. He had moved closer and was now crouching beside her. The heat from the embers cast a warm, orange glow on his face, softening its hard angles. He didn't reach over or take the wood from her. He simply pointed with a long finger. "Put the two biggest pieces on the sides, like so," he said, his voice a quiet rumble. "Then build a little bridge of smaller sticks across them. Leave a space in the middle. That's where you put the driest tinder." Mary followed his instructions, her nervousness slowly giving way to concentration. She worked with a new focus, her hands steadying as she built the small structure as he had directed. It was a simple, practical piece of advice, offered without condescension. When she was done, she looked to him for approval. He gave a slight nod. She struck a match, the flare of it seeming impossibly bright in the dim room. She held it to the tinder. A tiny flame licked at the wood shavings, flickered, and then, nourished by the draft she had created, it grew. It caught on the kindling, and soon a small, cheerful fire was crackling, pushing back the shadows. She sat back on her heels, watching the flames dance. A sense of relief washed over her, profound and surprising. It was as if she had not just built a fire, but had passed some kind of test. "Thank you," she said softly, not looking at him. "It's a handy thing to know," he replied, his voice still low. "Out here." They stayed like that for a long moment, two figures kneeling before the growing fire, the storm raging forgotten outside. The silence that returned was different now. It was less fraught with tension, more of a shared, quiet space. The little cabin felt less like a prison and more like a sanctuary. In the flickering firelight, Mary looked at the stranger, truly looked at him, and saw not a threat, but a man seeking shelter from a storm. Both outside and, she suspected, within. His face, etched with a sorrow she couldn't name, was no longer the face of a terrifying unknown, but of a fellow soul weathering the harshness of the world, and in that moment, she knew that whatever the town might say, she had done the right thing. The fire burned brightly between them, a small beacon of warmth and fragile trust in the heart of a wild, Wyoming night. The blizzard did not end with the dawn. Instead, the gray morning light revealed a world erased, a churning vortex of white that had swallowed the plains, the mountains, and the very sky. Mary woke on her narrow cot to the muffled silence of heavy snow, a quiet so profound it was more unsettling than the wind's shriek. For a disorienting second, she felt a peaceful relief, and then memory returned with a jolt. There was a man in her house. She sat up, clutching the quilt to her chin. He was not by the fire. He was sitting in the rocking chair, the one she usually occupied, but he was not rocking. He was perfectly still, a dark shape in the dim room. Staring into the flames he had clearly kept alive through the night. A tin cup of what she assumed was coffee rested on the floor beside him. He had been careful not to disturb her, yet his presence filled the small cabin, altering its very atmosphere. It no longer felt entirely hers. He must have sensed her movement, because he turned his head slowly. His gray eyes, shadowed with a lack of sleep, met hers. There was no threat in them, only a quiet acknowledgement of their strange predicament. "Morning, ma'am," he said, his voice a low rasp. "The storm settled in for a while, I reckon." Mary nodded, her throat too tight to speak. She felt a flush of embarrassment, her hair undone and her nightgown surely a sight. She swung her legs out of bed and quickly reached for her dress, turning her back to him as she fumbled with the buttons, her privacy a thin curtain of etiquette. "I see you kept the fire going," she managed to say, her voice sounding unnaturally high. "It seemed the sensible thing to do," he replied. An awkward silence fell as she finished dressing and quickly pinned up her hair. They were trapped. The thought was both terrifying and, in a strange way, she dared not examine. A relief. The judgment of Dust Creek could not reach her here. Not yet. First, they had to survive. She busied herself making oatmeal, the familiar task a comfort. He remained in the chair, watching the fire as if it held the answers to some deep and troubling question. When the porridge was ready, she ladled it into 2 bowls. She had so little, but it was unthinkable not to share it. She handed one to him. "I don't know your name," she said, the words feeling bold on her tongue. He looked from the bowl up to her face, a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes. "It's Luke," he said. "Luke Tanner. I am Mary Whitlock." The exchange of names felt like a treaty, a formal recognition of each other's humanity. They ate in silence, the only sounds the scrape of spoons against pottery and the soft hiss of the snow against the window panes. When they were finished, Luke took their empty bowls to the wash basin. His movements were economical and deliberate, the actions of a man long accustomed to looking after himself. As he stood, a drop of water fell from the ceiling, landing with a soft plink on the floorboards between them. Then another. Mary looked up. A dark, damp spot was spreading on the ceiling planks near the chimney. "Oh, no," she whispered. The storm was getting in. Luke's gaze followed hers. He set the bowls down and walked over, studying the spot with a practiced eye. Shingle must have worked loose in the wind last night. The snow is melting from the heat of the chimney pipe and seeping through. Panic tightened its cold grip around Mary's heart. Her cabin, her one safe place in this wild land, was failing her. "What can I do?" "Nothing to be done from the outside, not in this," he said, his tone calm and matter-of-fact. "But we can keep the water from doing too much damage inside." He took the empty water bucket and placed it on the floor beneath the drip. "For now, that'll have to do." His composure was a steadying force against her rising anxiety. He saw a problem and a practical, immediate solution. He did not seem worried. And because of that, her own fear began to subside. Later that morning, the snow eased into a temporary lull. The wind still moaned, but the world outside was visible again. A landscape of profound and beautiful desolation. The wood box, however, was nearly empty. Luke pulled on his still damp coat. "I'll chop some more firewood," he said. It wasn't a question or an offer, but a simple statement of what needed to be done next. Mary watched from the window as he waded through the deep snow to the woodpile. He found the axe she kept sheltered by the wall and set a log on the block. He paused, rolling his shoulders, and then began to work. The rhythmic thud of the axe was a solid, reassuring heartbeat in the muffled world. He worked with an easy, powerful grace, splitting the logs with clean, efficient strokes. He had taken off his coat, and the cold air made his breath plume. But he seemed impervious to it. The muscles in his back and shoulders moved under his worn wool shirt, a testament to a life of physical labor. As she watched, Mary's mind was a battlefield. One part of her, the part that listened to the whispers of Mrs. Greeley, was screaming. She was harboring a drifter, a nameless cowboy, a man whose past was a complete unknown. The town would be merciless. They would strip her of her position, her home, her good name. The thought sent a wave of cold dread through her that had nothing to do with the winter outside. But another part of her, a quieter, more honest voice, watched the man outside and felt a profound sense of security. The wind could howl, the snow could fall, the roof could leak, but that man, Luke Tanner, was splitting wood to keep them warm. He was a bulwark against the chaos. The fears the townswomen spoke of violent, unpredictable men seemed to fade when she looked at him. His violence was directed only at the wood, a productive and necessary act. His presence was not a threat. It was a shield. She felt safer with this stranger in her home than she had ever felt alone in it. He made several trips, stacking the freshly split wood by the hearth until the box was overflowing. He brought in a final armload, shaking the snow from his boots on the porch before stepping inside. His face was flushed from the cold and exertion. "That should last us a good while," he said, his quiet voice filling the room. The dripping from the ceiling had become more persistent. Luke looked at it, then around the small cabin. His eyes settled on a small tin of lard she kept for cooking. "Do you mind if I use some of that lard, ma'am?" Confused, she nodded. "Of course." He took a small amount on his fingers, climbed onto a chair, and carefully, painstakingly, worked the grease into the cracks between the ceiling planks around the damp spot. "It won't stop it for good," he explained, his voice slightly strained from the awkward angle. "But it'll slow it down. The grease will repel the water, give it a different path to follow." She watched, impressed by his simple ingenuity. It was a trick born of necessity, the kind of practical knowledge that meant the difference between survival and disaster in this country. When he was finished, he wiped his hands on a rag, and they watched the ceiling. The steady drip, drip, drip slowed. And then, for a while, it stopped altogether. He had mended her shelter from the inside out. The rest of the day passed in a series of quiet, shared tasks. He taught her how to bank the fire, covering the hot coals with ash so a bed of embers would remain in the morning. "Saves you a match and a lot of trouble on a cold morning," he'd said. She, in turn, shared her meager provisions, making a thin stew of potatoes and salted pork for their supper. They ate by the light of the fire and the single oil lamp she kept on her reading table. The lamp was her most cherished possession, a gift from her parents when she'd left for the West. Its steady, golden glow was her nightly companion, a small circle of civilization in the vast darkness. As she refilled the oil and trimmed the wick, she was acutely aware of him watching her. He sat on the other side of the hearth, his long legs stretched out before him, his face half in shadow. The light from her lamp touched the sharp line of his jaw, the weary set of his mouth. It was a face that had seen too much of the world, while hers had seen so little. "You read a lot," he observed, nodding toward the small stack of books on her table. "It helps the time pass," she said, "and it reminds me there's a world outside of all this." She gestured vaguely at the rattling window. "There is that," he said, a note of irony in his voice. He looked back into the fire. Sometimes the world outside is what a man's trying to get away from. The comment hung in the air between them, heavy with unspoken meaning. It was the first hint he had given of the shadows in his own life. Mary wanted to ask, to understand the source of the deep sadness in his eyes, but she did not dare. It was not her place. Instead, she picked up her Bible, its worn leather cover smooth beneath her fingers. She didn't open it, but just held it in her lap. "The lamp is a comfort," she said softly, changing the subject. "My father always said it's better to light one candle than to curse the darkness." Luke looked from the fire to the lamp, its flame burning pure and unwavering. "Your father was a wise man," he said. He held her gaze for a long moment, and in the warm, gentle light, Mary saw something shift in his expression. The weariness was still there, but it was joined by a flicker of something else, something softer. It was as if her small, steady flame had found an answering spark in the darkness of his own soul. For 2 more days, the blizzard held them captive. A strange and quiet domesticity settled over the cabin. They fell into a rhythm that needed few words. He would tend the fire, check his makeshift roof repair, and venture out to care for her 2 chickens in the coop, ensuring they had feed and water. She would cook their simple meals, mend her clothes, and try to plan lessons for her students. Though it was hard to concentrate, his presence was a constant, a quiet hum beneath the surface of her thoughts. She learned the sound of his breathing as he slept in the rocking chair, the low rumble of his voice when he spoke, the way he moved with a contained strength that was never menacing. Her fear of him was gone, replaced by a fragile, tentative trust. But her fear of the town remained, a cold knot in her stomach. The storm would end. He would leave, and she would be left to face the consequences. On the 3rd morning, they awoke to a different world. The wind had died, and the silence was absolute. A brilliant, painful sunlight streamed through the window, reflecting off a landscape buried in pristine, silent snow. The storm was over. Their time under her roof was coming to an end. The silence that greeted the end of the storm was a living thing. It pressed in on the small cabin, heavy and absolute. Outside, a brilliant, unforgiving sun cast the world in sharp relief, a sea of sculpted white under a painfully blue sky. The beauty of it was almost cruel. Inside, the quiet was thick with unspoken farewells. Luke Tanner moved with a purpose that seemed designed to hold emotion at bay. He had already pulled on his coat, which had dried stiffly by the fire. He took the last of the coffee, standing by the window and looking out at the transformed landscape. The gash on his temple had closed into a dark scab, a small mark of the ordeal that had brought him here. Mary watched him, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. A part of her, the sensible, cautious part, was flooded with relief. The danger was past, both from the storm and from the potential ruin of his presence. He would leave, and her life could return to its quiet, orderly rhythm. But another, more foolish part of her felt a pang of loss so sharp it was like a physical ache. The cabin already felt emptier, the silence that had been companionable now turning lonely. "I can't thank you enough, ma'am," he said, turning from the window. He set the empty cup down, his gaze meeting hers. For the first time, the deep weariness in his eyes seemed to have lessened, replaced by a clear, steady gratitude. "You saved my life. I won't forget it." "Anyone would have done the same," she said, though she knew it wasn't true. "No," he said simply, a quiet finality in his tone. "They wouldn't." He picked up his hat, turning the brim in his hands. "I need to see about my horse. Then I'll be on my way. I'm aiming for the Miller Ranch. See if they need a hand for the winter." I hope you find work," she said, the words feeling inadequate. He gave a slight nod and walked to the door. When he opened it, The cold, clean air that rushed in felt like the world reasserting its claim on them. He stepped outside, then paused, his gaze drawn upward to the roof. He stood there for a long moment, studying the spot above the chimney. "The patch I made won't last another storm," he said, looking back at her. "The shingles are torn loose. The whole section needs to be renailed." He looked from the roof to her, and she saw a flicker of indecision in his face. "It's not right for me to leave it like that. It's my fault the water got in. Let me fix it properly. I'll be quick about it." Mary hesitated. Every minute he stayed was another minute of risk. The snow would not keep the townspeople away for long. But she looked at the roof, at the clear concern on his face, and knew she could not refuse. It was a matter of pride for him, a debt he felt he needed to repay. "All right," she said. "The tools are in the woodshed." The news arrived in town on the small, snow-caked boots of 10-year-old Timothy Miller. His father, the rancher Luke was headed for, had sent him into Dust Creek to see if the general store was open and to check on the schoolteacher. The boy, full of the adventure of being the first to break a trail, found Miss Whitlock not huddled by her fire, but standing on her porch, handing nails up to a big man who was hammering away on her roof. Timothy stared, his eyes wide, then mumbled a greeting to his teacher and fled, his mind buzzing with the most exciting piece of news Dust Creek had seen all winter. By noon, the story was on every tongue. It began as a simple fact, but in the crucible of town gossip, it was quickly smelted into something else entirely. The fact that the man was a stranger, a drifter, was embellished with whispers of a dark look and a hard face. The fact that he had been there since the storm began was twisted until it implied he had been there all along. No one nurtured the burgeoning scandal with more care than Martha Greeley, a stout woman whose face was permanently set in a mask of pious disapproval. She presided over the town's social order from her throne at the boarding house. She saw laxity and sin where others saw mere humanity. To her, Mary Whitlock had always been suspect, with her books and her quiet reserve, which Mrs. Greeley mistook for arrogance. "Alone for 3 days and nights," she said, her voice carrying across the general store as she addressed a captive audience of 3 other women. "With a man of that type, a common cowhand, it is an affront to decency, an affront to the children we entrust to her care." The other women murmured in agreement, their faces a mixture of shock and delicious excitement. The schoolteacher, the one person in town meant to be a pillar of moral rectitude, had tumbled from her pedestal. The whispers soon found the ears of Deputy Cole, a man whose authority was vested more in his silver star than in any particular strength of character. Cole was used to being admired, or at least feared. Mary Whitlock's polite but unyielding refusals to his invitations for a walk or a church picnic had been a sharp sting to his vanity. He had told himself she was simply shy, that she would come around. The news that she had spent days sheltering another man, a rough-looking stranger no less, ignited a hot, possessive jealousy in his gut. It was a personal insult. He saddled his horse, his movements brisk with self-importance. He was the law. It was his duty to investigate, to ensure the schoolteacher was safe, though his real motive was to confront the man who had succeeded where he had failed. He found Luke just as he was driving the final nail. The roof looked solid, the new shingles blending in with the old. Luke was gathering his tools when Cole rode up, stopping his horse so close that Luke had to take a step back. "That's far enough," Cole said, his hand resting on the pistol at his hip. He didn't dismount, preferring to look down on the other man. "Who are you?" Luke looked up at him, his face impassive. The sun glinted off the deputy's star. "Name's Luke Tanner." "And what's your business at Miss Whitlock's residence?" Cole's voice was slick with insinuation. "Fixing her roof," Luke said, his tone even. "I hear you've been here a while, enjoying the teacher's hospitality through the storm." Before Luke could answer, the cabin door opened and Mary stepped out. She had seen the deputy's arrival from the window. and the sight of his smug, challenging posture had sent a surge of anger through her. "Deputy Cole," she said, her voice sharp and clear. "Is there a problem?" Cole's expression tightened at her tone. He tipped his hat, a gesture that was more mockery than respect. "Just checking on your welfare. Miss Whitlock found this fella here. Concerned for your safety is all." "My safety?" Mary's chin lifted. "This man's name is Mr. Tanner. His horse fell in the storm, and he came here seeking shelter. I gave it to him, as the Bible instructs us to do for strangers in need. He has been a perfect gentleman and has just now repaired the damage the storm did to my roof. I am in his debt." Her fierce defense only seemed to confirm Cole's suspicions. A gentleman. This ragged drifter. He smirked. "A lot can happen in 3 days. Ma'am, a woman alone has to be careful. Folks in town are concerned." "Let the folks in town mind their own business," Mary snapped, her patience gone. "I am perfectly fine." "I'll be the judge of that," Cole said. He swung down from his horse. "Tanner, you and I are going to have a talk. Down at my office." Luke straightened up, setting the hammer down carefully. He met the deputy's gaze, and for the first time, Mary saw a flicker of something cold and hard in his gray eyes. "I haven't broken any laws," he said, his voice dangerously quiet. "Vagrancy is a law." Cole shot back. "And I don't like your face. That's reason enough for me." "Deputy, this is ridiculous," Mary interjected, stepping between them. "He did nothing wrong." Cole ignored her. His eyes locked on Luke. It was a contest of wills, the puffed-up authority of the lawman against the quiet, unyielding strength of the drifter. Luke finally gave a slow, almost imperceptible nod. He seemed to recognize the futility of arguing. A fight here would only make things worse for her. "Let me get my things," Luke said. He walked past Mary into the cabin, Cole following a step behind him. Mary's hands were clenched into fists at her sides, a feeling of helpless fury washing over her. She watched as Luke rolled his thin bedroll and collected his coat. He paused at the door and looked at her. "Thank you for everything, Miss Whitlock," he said, his voice low and formal. It was as if a curtain had fallen between them again. She could only nod, her throat thick with unsaid words. She watched as Deputy Cole marched him toward the waiting horse, a triumphant swagger in his step. The world that had been so quiet and contained for 3 days had finally broken in, and it was every bit as ugly as she had feared. By evening, the town council had received a formal petition from the Ladies' Auxiliary, written in Martha Greeley's spidery, judgmental hand. It spoke of moral failings, of an unseemly living arrangement, and of the dangerous example being set for the children. It demanded the immediate termination of Miss Mary Whitlock's teaching contract. Luke was released from the town's single jail cell an hour later. Cole had found no grounds to hold him, but he had made his point. Luke headed straight for the saloon, not for a drink, but because it was the fastest place to hear the town's news. He stood at the back, nursing a single glass of water, and listened. He heard his own name, linked with Mary's, spoken in hushed, speculative tones. He heard the words disgrace and fired. The weight of it settled on him, heavier than any blizzard. He had brought his own storm to her doorstep. He walked back to her cabin under a sky full of cold, distant stars. The path was now a packed, trodden trail. When he knocked, she opened the door immediately, as if she had been waiting. Her face was pale in the moonlight, her eyes large and shadowed. "They're going to fire you," he said without preamble. It was not a question. She nodded, wrapping her arms around herself. "Mrs. Greeley is leading the charge." He looked past her, into the warm, small room that had been his sanctuary. He saw her books, her mending basket, the lamp burning steadily on the table. He had brought ruin to this place, to her. "I'm leaving," he said, his voice rough. "Tonight, I'll be long gone by morning. I'll tell Miller I changed my mind. Once I'm gone, maybe the talk will die down." He looked at her, his face a mask of regret. "I'm sorry. Mary, I never should have knocked on your door." "It's not your fault," she whispered. "Yes, it is," he said, his voice hard. "A man like me, I bring trouble with me. I should have kept riding. I should have frozen in a ditch before I brought this on you." He turned to go, to walk out into the night and disappear, to erase himself from her life. He took one step, and then she was in front of him, her small frame blocking the doorway. Her face was no longer pale and defeated. In the cool moonlight, her eyes burned with a fire he had not seen before. It was the fire of righteous anger. "No," she said, her voice shaking but firm. "You will not." He stopped, confused. "Mary, I have to. It's the only way to protect you, to save your name." "My name?" She gave a short, bitter laugh. "They have already decided what my name is worth. They have already judged me without a trial, without a question. They've judged you, too. They look at you and see a vagrant, a sinner. They don't see the man who kept me safe, who fixed my roof, who showed me nothing but kindness." She took a breath, her resolve hardening. "All my life, I have done what I was told. I have been proper. I have been quiet. I have been good. And for what? So that the first time I choose compassion over propriety. The Martha Greeley's of the world can tear me to shreds. No." She looked him straight in the eye, her gaze unwavering. "I will not let them chase a good man away to satisfy their own bitter, narrow minds. You don't have to go just because they don't understand." He stood there, stunned into silence by her fierce declaration. He had come to save her from the consequences of his presence, but she was refusing to be saved. She was standing her ground, not just for him, but for herself, for the principle of the thing. She was choosing to believe in the decency she had seen in him over the prejudice she was facing from everyone else. He saw in that moment not a fragile schoolteacher, but a woman of formidable, unexpected strength. He had sought shelter from the storm in her house, and now, it seemed, she was determined to be his shelter from the world. His decision to stay, prompted by her impassioned refusal to let him leave, altered the very air between them. He did not, of course, remain in her cabin, the woodshed. Small and drafty, but a solid shelter nonetheless, became his domain. It was a compromise, a small concession to the prying eyes of Dust Creek. Mary provided him with a spare blanket and a pillow, and in return, he became her silent, watchful guardian. A new, unspoken routine took root in the frozen earth around the schoolteacher's cabin. Each morning, Mary would walk to the schoolhouse, her head held high, ignoring the sudden silences that fell when she entered the general store, and the way other women would pull their children a little closer, their whispers following her like a flock of crows. The school board had called a meeting to discuss her situation, and her dismissal felt less like a possibility and more like an inevitability. Yet, she did not waver. Each day she faced the town was an act of quiet defiance, and each day, when she returned, there would be a fresh stack of firewood by her door, higher and neater than any she could have managed herself. The path to the well would be cleared of new snow. A loose shutter she hadn't even noticed was now firmly fixed. Luke worked from dawn until dusk, a tireless, solitary figure. He was repaying a debt, but it felt like more than that. He was building a fortress of small kindnesses around her, shoring up her world even as the town tried to tear it down. They spoke little, but their lives were deeply intertwined. She would leave a plate of hot food on the porch for him after supper. He, in turn, left a brace of rabbits he'd snared hanging by the door one morning. Their interactions were brief, almost formal, yet charged with an unspoken understanding. They were allies, two outcasts holding a small patch of ground against a hostile world. The nights were the most difficult. Mary would sit with her books, the lamp burning beside her, and she would see the faint glow of his own small lantern in the woodshed. The distance between the two lights seemed to represent the chasm of propriety and reputation they had crossed. She was no longer afraid of him, but she was becoming afraid of the strange, unfamiliar fluttering in her own chest whenever she thought of him out there, alone in the cold. One evening, nearly a week after the storm had ended, she saw him walking back from the woods, his axe over his shoulder. He moved with a weariness that went beyond a day's labor. He stopped by the woodpile, leaning heavily against it for a moment, his head bowed. When he straightened up, he winced, a sharp, involuntary movement as he rolled his left shoulder. She watched him from her window, a knot of concern tightening in her stomach. Later, when she brought his plate to the porch, he was sitting on the steps, rubbing the shoulder with a grim expression. "You've hurt yourself," she said, her voice soft. He looked up, startled. He had not heard her approach. He dropped his hand immediately, his face closing off. "It's nothing, just a knot from the chopping." "It looks like more than a knot," she insisted, setting the plate down beside him. "You've been favoring that shoulder all week." He didn't answer, his gaze fixed on the darkening plains. The silence was his shield, the one he had used his whole life to keep the world at a distance. But Mary was no longer the world. She was the one person who had not judged him. "Let me see it," she said. It was not a request, but a quiet command, the same tone she used in the classroom when a stubborn child refused to admit they couldn't read a word. He looked at her, his gray eyes shadowed with a deep reluctance. To show her his weakness felt like a betrayal of the strong, capable image he had tried to project. But there was no pity in her eyes, only a sincere, uncomplicated concern. Slowly, as if the motion caused him great pain, he nodded. "Inside," she said, "by the lamp." He followed her into the cabin, his large frame once again seeming to shrink the small space. He stood awkwardly in the center of the room as she put a kettle on the stove and fetched a clean cloth and a bowl from her washstand. "Sit," she said, motioning to the chair by the hearth. He obeyed, his movements stiff. When the water was warm, she brought the bowl over and knelt on the floor in front of him. "You'll have to take off your shirt." He hesitated for a long moment, then unbuttoned the worn wool shirt, his fingers clumsy. He shrugged it off his right shoulder first, then carefully, grimacing with the effort, worked it off his left. The firelight flickered across his bare torso. He was lean, his body a map of hard-won muscle, but it was the skin of his left shoulder that drew her gaze. It was a ruin of puckered, whitened tissue, the unmistakable scar of an old bullet wound, with angry red lines radiating from it where the damaged muscles were inflamed from overuse. Mary drew in a sharp breath. This was no woodsman's ache. This was a piece of a violent past, written on his very skin. She dipped the cloth in the warm water, wrung it out, and gently, her touch as light as a feather, she placed the compress on the inflamed area. He flinched, not from pain, but from her touch. It had been a long time since anyone had touched him with such tenderness. He sat rigid, his hands clenched into fists on his knees. As she began to clean the area, her movements deft and soothing. "A war wound?" she asked softly, her voice neutral, devoid of accusation. He was silent for so long she thought he would not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was a low, gravelly rasp, the sound of a man pulling words from a place of deep pain. "No," he said. "The war gave me its share of scars, but this one I got after." He stared into the fire, his eyes seeing not the dancing flames but something else, something far away and long ago. The quiet care of her hands seemed to have unlocked a door inside him that had been bolted shut for years. "After the fighting ended," he began, his voice barely a whisper, "I came back west. There wasn't much for a man who only knew how to follow orders and fire a rifle. I drifted, took work where I could find it. but it was a hard time. Sometimes. There was no work. A man still has to eat. He paused, and she continued her gentle ministrations. The silence, an invitation for him to continue. I fell in with a bad crowd, not because I wanted to, just because they had food and a fire, and I didn't. They were led by a man named Jeb Hollis. He was smart, and he was mean. He saw the world as a thing to be taken. Luke's voice was flat, devoid of emotion, a simple recitation of fact. I rode with them for a few months. I told myself it was just until I could get a real stake. I was just the horse wrangler. Mostly, I kept my head down. He took a ragged breath. There was a girl. Her name was Eleanor. She worked in a bakery in a town in Colorado. She was like a spring morning. She smelled of cinnamon and flour. She saw something in me that wasn't broken. We were going to be married. I was going to use my stake to buy a small piece of land. I was done with Hollis and his crew. I was going to be a different man. Mary's hand stilled for a moment. She could feel the tremor of grief that ran through his body, a deep, shuddering wave of old sorrow. She resumed bathing the wound, her touch a silent message of support. Hollis planned one last job, Luke said, his voice now thick with self-loathing. The bank in that same town. I told him I was out. He just laughed. He said a man is never out. He needed me to watch the horses. He promised it would be quick, that no one would get hurt. I was a fool to believe him, or maybe I just wanted to. He closed his eyes. Something went wrong. The shooting started. People screaming. I was with the horses down the alley. I should have ridden away. But I thought of Eleanor. Her bakery was just across the street. I ran toward the sound of the guns. To find her, to make sure she was safe. He stopped. The only sound in the room was the crackle of the fire and the ragged edge of his breathing. She was coming out of the mercantile next to the bank. He whispered. She had a bolt of blue cloth in her arms. She was going to make curtains for our house. She looked up, saw the commotion, and she froze. One of Hollis's men ran out of the bank, firing wild. I saw her fall. The words hung in the air, heavy and cold as stones. Mary felt her own heart clench in sympathetic pain. She could see it all, the bright sunshine, the blue cloth, the sudden, senseless violence. I didn't think, he went on, his voice dead. I just ran to her. That's when I got this. He gestured with his chin toward his shoulder. Hollis's bullet. He was shooting at the law, but he hit me instead. He and the others rode off and left me there, bleeding in the street next to her. He opened his eyes, and they were hollow, empty things. I held her hand until she was gone. The blue cloth was all stained with her blood. The story was finished. He had pulled the darkness he carried inside him out into the light, and he waited for her revulsion, for her judgment. He waited for her to recoil from the taint of his past. But Mary did not pull away. She finished bathing the wound, her touch as steady and gentle as before. She dried the skin, then took a small tin of salve from her medicine box and began to work it into the sore muscles. Her silence was not condemnation. It was a space for his grief to settle. He finally looked at her, his face ravaged with a guilt that time had not lessened. You see, he said, his voice cracking. That's who you've been protecting. That's the man you've defied this town for. A thief, a man who rode with killers, a man whose world got the only good thing in it destroyed. He looked down at her small, capable hands on his scarred skin. He looked at her face, illuminated by the lamplight, her expression full of a deep, sorrowful compassion he knew he did not deserve. The chasm between them seemed immense, impassable. She was goodness and light. He was a creature of shadow and regret. How can you even touch me? He whispered, his own self-hatred a raw wound. I am not worthy of your kindness. I am not worthy of you. Mary looked up from her work, her clear blue eyes meeting his tormented gray ones. She saw the depth of his self-loathing, the prison he had built for himself out of his past. The man I see, she said, her voice quiet but strong, "is the one who risked his life to find the woman he loved. The man I see is the one who has been paying for a mistake for 10 long years. The past does not have to be your jailer. Luke, you survived. That is not a sin." She finished her work and drew back. He slowly pulled his shirt back on, the rough wool a familiar, punishing shield. But as he buttoned it, he knew something had changed. He had shown her the worst of himself, and she had not turned away. Instead, she had knelt down and tended his wounds, both the one on his shoulder and the deeper one on his soul. He stood up and walked to the door, needing the cold night air, needing the distance of the woodshed. He had to be alone. He was too dangerous, too broken, to be near her light. But as he stepped out onto the porch, he heard her voice one last time. "Good night, Luke." It was a simple phrase, but in it, he heard no judgment, no fear, only acceptance. He walked to his small, cold shelter, feeling more alone, and yet, somehow, less lost than he had in a decade. The uneasy truce with the town of Dust Creek was as thin and fragile as the first layer of ice on a puddle. For a week, Mary continued to teach, her classroom attendance only slightly diminished by a few mothers who had sided decisively with Mrs. Greeley. And for a week, Luke remained in the woodshed, a silent, industrious phantom on the edge of her property. He had found a few days' work helping Mr. Miller dig out his cattle from the snowdrifts, earning enough for tobacco and a few provisions. But he always returned at dusk to the small, cold shelter that had become his post. He told himself he was staying to ensure the town council didn't simply throw her out on the street. He told himself he was repaying her kindness. But as he sat by his small lantern at night, cleaning the old pistol he'd kept wrapped in an oilcloth in his bedroll, he knew the truth was more complicated. He was staying because leaving felt like a betrayal. He was staying because the quiet courage in Mary Whitlock's eyes had rekindled something in him he thought long dead. The sky, which had been a brilliant, clear blue for days, began to sour. A familiar gray pallor spread from the west, and the wind, which had been sleeping, began to stir with a low growl. Another storm was coming. Luke could feel it in the ache of his old wound, a deep, throbbing barometer of coming trouble. It arrived not as a blizzard, but as a trio of riders, dark figures against the bleak afternoon landscape. They were not from Dust Creek. Luke saw them from the edge of the woods where he'd been checking his snares. They rode with the weary slump of men who had spent too long in the saddle, their horses lathered and tired, but there was a coiled tension about them, a hungry, watchful stillness that set every nerve in Luke's body on edge. He recognized the posture. He knew the breed. He watched as they rode directly to the saloon, dismounting and tying their horses with a carelessness that suggested they planned to stay a while. He did not recognize them, but he recognized their leader's type instantly. A big man with a thick, untrimmed beard and eyes that were small and sharp, like chips of flint. Luke's first instinct was to go to Mary, to warn her, but warn her of what that 3 hard-looking men had ridden into town that was hardly news in Wyoming. An alarm from him. The town pariah would only bring more trouble down on her. Instead, he retreated to the woodshed, his hand resting on the grip of his pistol. He would watch, and he would wait. The arrival of the strangers sent a ripple of excited fear through Dust Creek. In the saloon, the big man, who called himself Jeb Hollis, bought a round of whiskey and asked questions. His questions were not about work or lodging, but about the town's history. He asked about old claims, old homesteads, and, most particularly, about the new schoolhouse. By the time Deputy Cole swaggered into the saloon to assess the newcomers, Martha Greeley was already holding court in the general store. "Riff-raff," she declared to anyone who would listen. "Drawn here by other riff-raff, I tell you, that Tanner man has brought a curse on this town. Filth always finds its own." The idea, planted by her malice and watered by the town's fear, took root with terrifying speed. When Jeb Hollis mentioned he'd heard a man named Tanner was in the area, The theory became fact in the minds of many. Cole, feeling the eyes of the town upon him, saw his chance. He could be the hero who ran the vagrants out and put the schoolteacher's protector in his place. He confronted Hollis, who merely laughed a deep, rumbling laugh. "Just passing through. Lawman," Hollis said, his flinty eyes glinting with amusement. "Looking for a friend." The lie was as smooth and cold as a river stone. As evening fell, a bitter, driving snow began to fly. Borne on the back of a furious wind, the true storm, the one Luke had been sensing all day, had arrived. The townspeople scurried into their homes, bolting their doors against the weather and the uneasy feeling the strangers had brought. Mary was working late in the schoolhouse, correcting her students' slates by the light of her oil lamp. The meeting with the school board was tomorrow, and she wanted to be prepared. She refused to give them any excuse to say she had neglected her duties. The schoolhouse was cold, the potbelly stove fighting a losing battle against the drafts. But it was a place of peace. Here, she was still the teacher. Here, the whispers of the town could not reach her. The only sounds were the scratching of her chalk and the rising howl of the wind. The crash of the schoolhouse door being kicked open sent a spray of snow and icy air into the room. Mary leaped to her feet, her heart seizing in her chest. 3 men filled the doorway, their faces red with cold and whiskey, their eyes hard. The big man, Jeb Hollis, stepped forward, a cruel smile twisting his lips. 2 other men fanned out behind him, their hands on their pistols. "Evening, teacher," Hollis grunted, his gaze sweeping the empty room. "Sorry to interrupt your lessons." Mary stood frozen behind her desk, her hand instinctively going to the oil lamp, its warm glass a small, solid reality in a world that had suddenly turned into a nightmare. "What do you want?" she asked, her voice a thin, reedy thing. "Information," Hollis said, walking further into the room, his boots loud on the wooden floor. He kicked at one of the small student desks, sending it scraping across the floorboards. "This schoolhouse, it was built on the old Calloway place, wasn't it?" Mary stared at him, uncomprehending. I don't know. I'm new here." Hollis's smile vanished. He took another step, looming over her desk. "Don't play dumb with me. Old man Calloway was a paymaster for the railroad. He died before he could tell anyone where he buried the payroll. They say it was under the floorboards of his cabin. This cabin." He stomped his boot on the floor. "And we're here to collect it." The truth of the situation crashed down on her. They weren't just drifters. They were thieves. "There's nothing here," she said, her voice shaking. "It's just a school." "We'll be the judge of that," Hollis snarled. He turned to his men. "Tear this place apart." From his vantage point in the woodshed, Luke saw the lights in the saloon go out, and then, a few minutes later, he saw 3 figures struggling through the thickening snow, heading not toward the boarding house, but toward the school. A cold dread, heavy and familiar, settled in his gut. He grabbed his coat and pistol and melted into the swirling chaos of the storm, circling around to approach the school from the back. Just as he reached the cover of a small copse of trees, he saw another group of men, a shambling, disorganized party led by Deputy Cole, heading for Mary's cabin. They were carrying lanterns and rifles. Luke heard Cole's voice, bellowing over the wind. "Tanner, we know you're in there. We know you're in league with them. Come out now." The betrayal was so swift, so absolute, it stole Luke's breath. They weren't going to help her. They thought he was part of it. They had already tried and convicted him, and in doing so, they had abandoned Mary to her fate. They left her alone. The words echoed in his mind, a ghostly refrain from a decade ago. Not again. Not this time. He ignored the shouts of the posse and crept toward the back of the schoolhouse. Inside, he could hear the sounds of splintering wood and the men's rough laughter. Peering through the window, he saw a scene of violent desecration. Desks were overturned, books were thrown to the floor, and one of the men was using a crowbar to pry up the floorboards. Mary was huddled near the potbelly stove, her face a white mask of terror. She still clutched her lamp, its small, steady flame a single point of defiant light in the chaos. And Jeb Hollis, the man who had left him to die, was standing over her, his shadow swallowing her whole. Rage, cold and pure, surged through Luke. He remembered this window. He had fixed a loose pane on it just days ago. He tested it now. It was still a little loose. Using the blade of his knife, he carefully, silently, worked the latch free. The wind covered the small sounds. He slid the window up just enough to slip through, landing in a crouch in the darkened cloakroom at the back of the school. The men were too engrossed in their work to notice. He drew his pistol, the cold steel a familiar weight in his hand. He took a steadying breath, the air thick with the smell of sawdust and stale whiskey. He had a clear shot at Hollis's back, but there were two other men. He had to be smarter than that. He kicked open the cloakroom door, stepping into the main room. "Looking for me, Jeb," he said, his voice level and cold. Hollis spun around, his face a mask of shock, then recognition, then fury. "Tanner," he spat. "I should have known you'd crawl out from whatever rock you'd been hiding under." The other two men turned, their hands going for their guns. But Luke was already moving, diving behind the teacher's heavy oak desk as the first shot roared, splintering the wall where his head had been. He fired back, not at Hollis, but at the lamp one of the men had set on the floor. It shattered, plunging half the room into darkness, illuminated only by Mary's small lamp and the glowing embers in the stove. Another shot flashed in the dark, and Luke felt a hot sting as a bullet grazed his arm. He fired again, and one of the men let out a choked cry and crumpled to the floor. "You always were a snake, Tanner," Hollis roared from the darkness. "Turning on your own." "You were never my own," Luke called back, reloading his pistol with practiced, desperate speed. Suddenly, the front door burst open again. It was Deputy Cole, his face a mixture of fear and bravado, his pistol waving wildly. "Drop your weapons, all of you," he yelled. In the confusion, Hollis's remaining man saw his chance. He fired at the deputy. Cole, panicking, returned fire, not at the outlaw, but blindly into the room. A stray bullet ricocheted off the iron stove. Cole cried out and fell backward out the door. His own incompetence, his final undoing. Now it was just Luke and Hollis, two ghosts from a violent past, facing each other in the ruined schoolhouse. Hollis fired, the muzzle flash momentarily illuminating his hate-filled face. Luke felt the bullet tear through the fleshy part of his side, a deep, sickening impact that almost made him black out. He gritted his teeth, aimed at the last flash, and pulled the trigger. The explosion was followed by a heavy, final thud, and then silence, a profound, ringing silence, broken only by the howl of the wind and Mary's ragged, terrified sobs. Luke pushed himself up, leaning heavily on the desk. His side was on fire, and his vision was starting to blur at the edges. But he saw her. She was still huddled by the stove, unharmed, and the lamp, her lamp, was still clutched in her hand, its small flame burning, impossibly, in the midst of the darkness, the violence, and the storm. He staggered toward her, his legs threatening to give out, and collapsed to his knees on the floor in front of her, his strength finally gone. The last thing he saw before the darkness took him was her face, her beautiful, tear-streaked face, illuminated by the unwavering light of her faith. The world swam back into focus, not as a single image, but as a series of fractured sensations. The first was the wind, a relentless, mournful cry that seemed to seep through the very walls of his consciousness. The second was a searing pain in his side, a fire that consumed his breath. And the third, the one that anchored him, was a gentle pressure on his forehead, a cool cloth that was a small mercy in a world of agony. He heard a voice, faint and distant, calling his name over and over. Mary. He tried to open his eyes, but the effort was too great. He felt himself being moved, a jolting, agonizing journey that made him cry out. He was dimly aware of the biting cold, of snow on his face, and then of a sudden, profound warmth. The smell of wood smoke and coffee filled his senses, a scent he had now associated with a safety he had not known in years. He was in her cabin. He was alive. The hours that followed were a fevered blur, a dark, churning sea of pain and memory. He was back in Colorado, the sun bright on the dusty street, the scent of cinnamon from Eleanor's bakery in the air. He saw the flash of guns, the terrible bloom of red on the blue cloth she carried. Then the scene would shift, and he was staring into Jeb Hollis's hate-filled eyes, the roar of the pistol deafening in the small schoolhouse. He would thrash against the ghosts, his voice a raw whisper, begging for a forgiveness he knew he could never earn. Through it all, Mary was a constant, unwavering presence. She became a creature of pure, focused will. When the men from the posse, their courage returned now that the shooting had stopped, finally peered into the schoolhouse, they found a scene of carnage. 2 outlaws and the town's deputy were dead. The schoolteacher's protector was bleeding out on the floor, and the schoolteacher herself was kneeling beside him, tearing strips from her own petticoat to press against his wounds, her face fierce and determined in the lamplight. Mr. Miller was the first to find his voice. "We'll get the doctor, Miss Whitlock." "There's no time," she said, not looking up from her work. "He'll die if we wait. Help me get him to my cabin, now." There was a moment of stunned silence. To bring this man, the cause of all this trouble, back into her home after what had happened seemed an act of madness. But the look in her eyes, the steel in her voice, quelled any argument. With the help of Mr. Miller and another rancher, they managed to half-carry, half-drag Luke's dead weight through the deepening snow, a small, grim procession fighting against the storm. They laid him on her cot, the clean sheets immediately stained with his blood. The town doctor, a weary, whiskey-scented man named Harris, arrived an hour later. He probed the wounds, his face grim. One went clean through his side, nasty, but it missed anything vital. "I think the one in his arm is just a graze. He's lost a lot of blood. The fever will be the thing that decides it." He poured a generous amount of carbolic acid on the wounds, making Luke arch in unconscious agony. He bandaged him tightly, then turned to Mary. "Keep him warm. Try to get some broth into him if he wakes. There's nothing more I can do. It's in God's hands now." And in hers. For 2 days and 2 nights, Mary did not sleep. She was a general commanding a tiny army of one in a war against death. She bathed his feverish skin, changed his bloody bandages, and held a cup of water to his cracked lips, coaxing him to drink. She listened to his delirious ramblings, the broken pieces of his past tumbling out in the darkness. She heard Eleanor's name, spoken with a tenderness that broke her heart. She heard Hollis's name, spat with a venomous hatred. She heard his pleas for forgiveness, addressed to a ghost she could not see. She would place a cool hand on his forehead and murmur soothing words, her voice a low, steady counterpoint to the storm in his mind. "Hush now, Luke," she would say. "You're safe. Rest now." Outside the small, steamed-up windows of the cabin, the world was changing. The blizzard raged for another full day, and then, as suddenly as it had begun, it broke. The wind died, and a profound quiet settled over the land. The sun emerged, weak at first, then stronger, and the great melting began. The sound of dripping water from the eaves became the cabin's new heartbeat, a soft, persistent rhythm of release. The hard, white edges of the world began to soften, the snow shrinking away from the cabin walls, revealing the dark, damp earth beneath. The story of that night in the schoolhouse spread through the town, carried by the men who had witnessed the aftermath. The narrative once so firmly set against Luke, was shattered and rebuilt. They had found the pried-up floorboards, the thieves' tools. They had seen the bodies. They knew that Deputy Cole, in his final, panicked moments, had been firing blindly. They learned that Luke Tanner had not been an accomplice. He had been a savior. The tide of public opinion, so swift to condemn, was just as swift to reverse itself. Mrs. Greeley found her pronouncements on sin and moral decay met with cold stares. The story of Mary Whitlock was no longer one of a fallen woman, but of a brave one who had harbored a hero. The petition to have her fired was quietly withdrawn from the town council's agenda. She had been vindicated by blood and violence, her reputation cleansed by the very storm that had threatened to destroy it. Mary knew little of this. Her world had shrunk to the four walls of her cabin, to the life and death struggle being waged on her narrow cot. On the third morning, she awoke from a brief, fitful sleep in a rocking chair to find him watching her. The fever had broken. His gray eyes, though sunken and shadowed, were clear and lucid for the first time. "Mary," he whispered, his voice a dry, cracked version of its own. A wave of relief so powerful it made her dizzy washed over her. She was at his side in an instant, a cup of water in her hand. "Luke, you're awake." He drank greedily, then sank back against the pillow, exhausted by the small effort. He looked around the room, at the basin of bloody water, at the pile of discarded bandages. His gaze fell upon her, and he saw the dark circles under her eyes, the weary slump of her shoulders. He had brought his war into her peaceful home. "I've brought you nothing but ruin," he rasped, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. Mary set the cup down and took his hand. It was warm, no longer burning with fever. "You're wrong," she said, her voice soft but firm. "You brought me trouble. Yes, but you did not bring me ruin." He tried to pull his hand away, a flicker of the old shame returning. "They'll still run you out of town. A woman's reputation." "The town will think what it wants," she interrupted, her grip tightening on his hand. "That is not what matters. What matters is the truth. And the truth is, you saved my life." He looked away, his gaze fixed on the ceiling where his own clumsy patch had held against the storm. The sound of melting snow dripped steadily from the roof he had mended. He felt a profound sense of unworthiness, a gulf between her goodness and his own violent past that seemed wider than ever. He was a killer, a drifter. She was a teacher, a healer. He had no place in her world. "You should have let me go," he said, his voice thick with regret. "You should have let Cole take me away." "No," she said. She leaned closer, forcing him to meet her eyes. Her face was tired, but her expression was one of absolute certainty. "I saw a good man that day. Luke, not the man you told me you were, but the man I saw with my own eyes. The world tried to tell me you were one thing, but my heart told me you were another. I chose to believe my heart." He stared at her, overwhelmed by the simple, unshakable faith in her words. No one had ever looked at him like that, as if he were someone worth believing in. He felt the hard walls he had built around himself for a decade begin to crack. She saw the conflict in his eyes, the deep, churning storm of guilt and doubt that still raged within him. She gave his hand a gentle squeeze, her voice dropping to a near whisper, filled with an emotion so deep and true it was almost painful to speak aloud. "You saved me from the storm out there," she said, her gaze never leaving his. "The wind and the snow, the violence. You stood between me and all of it." She took a breath, and the words that came next were a vow, a promise, a plea. "But it is I who wants to keep you from the storm in your heart." He closed his eyes, unable to bear the raw honesty in hers. Her words were a balm, a cool hand on a lifetime of burns. He had thought love was something he had lost forever, a bright memory buried in a Colorado grave. He had thought redemption was a preacher's fantasy, but as he lay there, broken and weak, in the care of this quiet, courageous woman, listening to the sound of the world thawing outside. He felt the first tentative rays of a light he had long ago given up on ever seeing again. He did not know what the future held, or if a man like him could ever truly be cleansed of his past. But for the first time in 10 years, he felt the possibility of hope. The world was reborn in water. The great silent mountains of snow wept themselves into rivers that carved new paths through the plains. The iron-hard ground softened, breathing out the deep, rich scent of damp earth and crushed pine. Patches of determined green appeared on the south-facing slopes, and the sky, which had been a hard, metallic gray for so long, was now a canvas of soft blues and high, wispy clouds. The birds returned, their songs attentive, then triumphant, chorus that stitched the silence of winter back together. Spring had come to Wyoming. With the thaw came Luke's strength. Color returned to his face, the gaunt, fevered look replaced by the familiar bronze of a man who lives under the open sky. The wound in his side closed into a raw, puckered scar, a new entry in the violent ledger of his skin, but it no longer pained him with every breath. He began to walk without a limp, at first just to the woodpile, then farther, his long strides eating up the miles as he scouted the land, his body reacquainting itself with the freedom of movement. He took over the heavy chores with a quiet efficiency, his axe once again ringing out in the clear morning air, a sound that Mary had come to associate with safety and the steady, dependable rhythm of her new life. She had her own battles to fight, though they were quieter ones. She had returned to the schoolhouse, which Mr. Miller and a few other ranchers had helped her repair. The bullet holes were patched, the broken desks mended. She faced her students, and the town, with a newfound poise she hadn't known she possessed. The whispers had not vanished entirely, but they had changed their tune. She was no longer a subject of scandal, but of a grudging, curious respect. She had faced down outlaws. She had nursed a man back from the brink of death. She was no longer the fragile, out-of-place teacher from Ohio. She was a woman of the West, forged in its storms. Yet, as Luke's body mended, a strange and painful distance began to grow between them. The easy intimacy of the sick room, where she was his caretaker and he was wholly dependent on her, vanished with his fever. As he regained his physical autonomy, he began to retreat behind the old walls of silence and reserve. The quiet companionship they had shared in the aftermath of the storm was replaced by a formal, stilted courtesy. He would thank her for his meals, his eyes never quite meeting hers. He would leave for his day's work with a brief nod and return at dusk, retreating to the woodshed without a word. Mary felt his withdrawal like a physical chill. She had given him her care, her home, her reputation, in the quiet hours of his recovery, watching him sleep. She had admitted the truth to herself. She had given him her heart as well. And now, he was taking it with him as he pulled away, step by silent step. She saw the old storm gathering in his eyes, the familiar tempest of guilt and self-loathing, and she felt utterly helpless against it. He was healing his body only to find the strength to leave her. The breaking point came on an evening gilded with the promise of summer. The sunset was a spectacular, fiery affair, painting the western sky in strokes of orange, pink, and deep violet. Luke had spent the day at the Miller Ranch, helping with the branding. He returned smelling of sagebrush, sweat, and wood smoke. Mary had made a stew, and she waited for him on the porch, determined to break through the wall he had built between them. He approached the cabin, but instead of coming to the porch, he stopped by the woodpile. He did not look at her. He looked out at the magnificent, bleeding sky. "I spoke with Miller today," he said, his voice quiet, directed at the horizon. "He's offered me a permanent position, bunkhouse, steady pay. I'll be starting tomorrow." The words were simple, practical, but to Mary, they were a death sentence. Bunkhouse, a life separate from hers. He was making his plans, and they did not include her. The stew she had so carefully prepared suddenly felt like a foolish, childish offering. "I see," she said, her voice betraying none of the shattering devastation she felt. "It's for the best," he continued, still not looking at her. "The town's finally leaving you be. With me gone, things can get back to normal for you. You can be the schoolteacher they hired." "And what if I don't want normal?" The question escaped her, sharper than she intended. He finally turned to look at her. In the soft, dying light, his face was a landscape of sorrow. "Mary, you don't know what you're saying. You have a life here, a good, clean life. I don't belong in it. I never did." "That is for me to decide," she said, standing up and walking toward him, her hands clenched at her sides. She stopped a few feet from him, forcing him to face her. "Why are you doing this, Luke? Why are you running away?" "I'm not running," he said, his voice rough. "I'm protecting you. From me." "Protecting me?" A bitter laugh escaped her. "You think after all this, I am afraid of you?" "You should be," he said, his voice low and intense. "You saw what I am. You heard what I did. Men like Hollis, they are my past. A past like that doesn't just die. It follows you. It has a way of showing up when you least expect it. I won't have it touch you. I won't have my darkness cast a shadow on your light." "My light?" she said, stepping closer still, her voice dropping to a fierce whisper. "Do you think my life was so full of light before you came? It was quiet, and it was safe, and it was achingly lonely. You talk about your darkness, but you are the one who taught me what courage looks like. You are the one who taught me that a person is more than the worst thing they have ever done." She looked up at him, her eyes pleading. "Don't you see my life didn't truly begin until the night you knocked on my door?" He looked down at her, his face a mask of torment. Every word she spoke was a sweet torture. The thing he wanted most in the world, the thing he was convinced he could never have. He had to make her understand. He had to save her from himself. He reached into the pocket of his shirt and pulled out a small, tarnished silver locket, attached to a delicate chain. He held it in his calloused palm as if it were a living, wounded thing. "This was hers," he said, his voice cracking. "Eleanor's. I've carried it for 10 years, a reminder of what I lost, of what I cost her." He looked from the locket to Mary's face, his eyes full of a terrible, final resolve. "A man like me doesn't get a second chance at this. I had my share of goodness, and I let it be destroyed. To try and claim it again with you, it would be a sacrilege. It would be a betrayal of her memory, and it would be the ruin of yours." He had laid his soul bare, offering her the ugliest, most broken part of himself as proof that she should let him go. He expected her to recoil, to finally see the truth and turn away. But Mary did not recoil. She looked at the locket, then back at his face, and her expression was not one of horror, but of infinite, heartbreaking compassion. And then she did something that shattered his defenses completely. She reached out and gently closed his fingers over the locket. "Her memory is not a cage. Luke," she said softly, "it is a part of you. The part that loves so deeply you were willing to run into gunfire. The part that has grieved so faithfully for 10 years. I am not trying to replace her. I am asking you to let her memory be a blessing, not a curse." And then he broke. The iron control he had maintained for a decade finally gave way. A single tear traced a path through the dust on his cheek. He sank to his knees before her, not out of weakness, but out of a profound and overwhelming surrender. He was on his knees in the soft, damp earth, the setting sun casting them in a divine, golden light. He opened his hand again, offering her the locket, offering her all of it, his past, his grief, his broken heart. "I can't carry it anymore," he whispered, his voice choked with emotion. "And I can't leave you. I don't know how." He looked up at her, his soul naked in his eyes. You taught me, Mary, you taught me that no one is too guilty to be loved." Mary knelt in front of him, her own tears falling freely now. She took the locket from his hand, its cool metal a tangible link to the past he was finally entrusting to her. She did not put it on. She simply held it, a sacred trust. As she did, the air changed. A soft coolness kissed her cheek, and then another. A gentle rain began to fall, not a violent storm, but a soft, cleansing spring shower. It fell on the thirsty earth, on the new green grass, on their bowed heads. It was a baptism, a new beginning. She leaned forward and, in the soft, quiet rain, she kissed him. It was not a kiss of passion, but of homecoming. It was a kiss of profound relief, of acceptance, of a love that had been tested by storms both real and imagined. It was the taste of salt from their tears and the clean, sweet taste of rain. In that moment, he was not a drifter, and she was not a schoolteacher. They were simply two souls who had found shelter in each other, their pasts washed clean, their future just beginning to grow. The year that followed was not one of grand, sweeping changes, but of small, quiet miracles. The seasons turned, dressing the plains in the fleeting green of spring, the sun-scorched tan of summer, and the deep gold of autumn. And with each turn, the life that Mary Whitlock and Luke Tanner were building together took deeper root in the Wyoming soil. Dust Creek did not forget what had happened, but the memory of it was transformed. The story of the schoolhouse siege became a local legend, a cautionary tale about the dangers of the frontier and the folly of swift judgment. Deputy Cole was buried and largely unmourned, his name a byword for arrogant incompetence. The outlaws were a grim reminder of the darkness that could ride in on any wind. But the names of Mary and Luke were now spoken with a quiet, hard-won respect. They were no longer the fallen schoolteacher and the vagrant drifter. They were survivors. They were their own people. Mary continued to teach. She stood before her students in the repaired schoolhouse, not just as an instructor of letters and sums, but as a living lesson in courage. The children looked at her with a kind of awe. The parents, even those who had once clutched their children tighter when she passed, now greeted her with nods of genuine warmth. They brought her jars of preserves and fresh-baked bread. Martha Greeley, her power to incite righteous mobs broken, now offered Mary a curt, tight-lipped nod when they passed in the general store, which for her was the equivalent of a full apology. Mary had won her place not by conforming to the town's expectations, but by holding fast to her own convictions. The little cabin was no longer a lonely outpost, but her home, a sanctuary she had defended and sanctified. Luke had accepted the job at the Miller Ranch. He had a bunk in the bunkhouse, but he spent most of his free hours on the small patch of land surrounding Mary's cabin. He was a man transformed. The deep, weary sadness in his eyes had been replaced by a quiet, steady calm. The ghosts of his past still walked with him. He knew they always would, but they no longer held dominion over him. He was known at the ranch as the hardest worker and the quietest man, one who spoke little but whose word, when given, was as solid as the mountains on the horizon. Mr. Miller treated him less as a hired hand and more as a trusted friend, a partner in the endless work of taming a small piece of the wild land. Their love story was not written in passionate declarations, but in the steady, unassuming rhythm of their days. In the evenings, Luke would ride over from the ranch, his silhouette a welcome and familiar sight against the setting sun. They would sit together on the porch, the same porch where he had once collapsed, a wounded stranger seeking shelter. They would talk of their days of a student who had finally grasped long division, of a new calf born at the ranch. They were small, ordinary conversations, but they were the threads from which a life was woven. Sometimes they would sit in comfortable silence, watching the stars ignite in the vast, dark sky, a shared peace between them that needed no words. He had never again stayed the night in her cabin. Their courtship was patient, proper, and achingly tender, conducted in full view of the world that had once been so eager to condemn them. They were rebuilding not just their own lives, but the very definition of honor, on their own terms. The locket, Eleanor's locket, rested in a small, carved wooden box on Mary's mantelpiece. She had never tried to hide it. It was a part of him, and so it became a part of their story, a testament to the love and loss that had shaped the man he was. Its presence was not a shadow between them, but a quiet acknowledgement of the past's power, and of their power to live with it, and beyond it. One evening in late summer, as the sun began its slow, magnificent descent, Mary sat on the porch steps, brushing her hair, the honey-colored locks, now free from the severe bun she wore for school, cascaded over her shoulders, shimmering in the golden light. It was a quiet, private ritual, a moment of peace at the end of the day. The rhythmic pull of the brush through her hair was a soothing, meditative act. She heard the familiar sound of his horse and looked up to see him riding toward her. He dismounted and walked not to the steps, but to the small patch of wildflowers he had cultivated for her by the side of the cabin. He stood there for a moment, then came toward her, his hands behind his back, a small, shy smile playing on his lips. He stopped in front of her, his tall frame blocking the last of the setting sun. "I made something for you," he said, his voice a low rumble. He brought his hands forward, and in his palm lay a comb. It was carved from a piece of smooth, pale cottonwood, sanded until it shone. It was not a fancy, store-bought thing, but a piece of simple, heartfelt artistry. The back of the comb was intricately carved with a spray of daisies, their petals small and perfect, their centers detailed with a loving precision. Mary gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. She looked from the comb to his face, her eyes filling with tears. She understood the gift immediately. A comb, an object of such simple intimacy. Daisies, the flowers of innocence and new beginnings. He was not just giving her a beautiful object. He was giving her back her honor, an honor he felt had been tarnished by his presence, now restored through his love and his art. It was a gift of profound tenderness, a declaration more powerful than any words. She put down her brush and took the comb from his hand, her fingers tracing the delicate carving. "It's the most beautiful thing I have ever seen," she whispered. "It's not much," he said, his gaze full of a deep, abiding love. "But every time you touch it, I want you to remember that you are the finest, strongest woman I have ever known. You are the honor in my life, Mary." She stood up then, the carved comb clutched in her hand, and stepped into his arms. He held her close, his chin resting on the top of her head, surrounded by the scent of her clean hair. They stood like that for a long time, two solitary figures who had found their home in each other, the silence between them full of a perfect, unspoken understanding. Finally, they turned, his arms still around her shoulders, and looked out at the world they had made. The prairie was bathed in the soft, purple light of twilight, a vast and peaceful sea stretching to the edge of the world. The land was still wild, the nights were still dark, and the winters would always be hard. But it was no longer a place of fear or loneliness. It was a place of possibility. They had weathered the storms of nature and the uglier storms of human judgment. They had learned that justice was not always found in a lawman's star, but in the quiet courage of a compassionate heart. And they had discovered that true love was not a magical cure for the wounds of the past, but a patient, steady light that could guide you through the darkness. A quiet act of redemption performed not by angels, but by the simple, unwavering kindness of another human being. They looked toward the horizon, where the last sliver of a sun had disappeared, leaving behind a promise of the dawn to come. On the vast and open plains of Wyoming, they had found their freedom. Thank you for listening to our story. We'd love to see where you're listening from in the comments below, so we can all connect and share our thoughts. Please subscribe to our channel, Wild West Night, like this video, And support us further by pressing the hype button so this story can be heard by more people.